right, so I think that we had left off, we had just finished talking about all of our different kinds of mnemonics and ways of encoding memory. We're good there? All right. And so we're going to start today talking about memory retrieval, so that process of actually pulling information back out of our long-term memory and into our either working memory or short-term memory, one of our immediate memories that would be in our direct consciousness. So if we're trying to remember something, to do something with that information, that's the retrieval process. And most of the failures in memory that we have are usually failures to retrieve. And this just means that in a lot of cases, it's not that the information was never encoded in the first place, it's that it's there, but we can't quite get to it. So if we think of that process of where with encoding, if you sort of make more connections, you have a stronger pathway, you're less likely to lose the path to get to the item that you're trying to find. So a failure of memory with a failure to retrieve would be that you couldn't find the right path. And we're going to start seeing some of the ways, especially right on the next slide when we start talking about cues, are ways to sort of hint at where we should go looking to find that information. And so a lot of times you can illustrate this really well if you're having a conversation and maybe there's a word or a concept that it's just on the tip of your tongue, but you can't quite sort of remember what the word is. That would be a failure to retrieve because you know that you know the answer. And if somebody gave you a hint, you could probably come up with it, but you can't get there right now. And so we can also call those hints cues. And cues are just any kind of stimulus that leads to activation of information that's stored in your long-term memory. So it's something that kind of directs you in the right way to go and retrieve that information. And with our sort of standard pattern of memory where more is usually better, multiple types are usually better, and things that have meaning are usually better, with cues, if you have multiple cues, it usually leads you to better retrieval. So where it was good to have multiple methods of encoding, it's also good to have multiple things that help you remember to retrieve. And that's just because having multiples gives you sort of deeper levels of processing and more possibilities to pull the right information. We can also focus in on the fact that self-generated cues are actually a lot better than those generated by others. And that's just because you know yourself a lot better than anyone else knows you or you know anyone else. So you can kind of imagine this like if you've ever played Pictionary with someone who, say a sibling, someone you grew up with, someone you know really well, and you get each other, you know exactly what they're drawing and why. But if you play with a complete stranger, maybe your sibling brings home a significant other and you've never played with them before, but you get stuck on the same team and you have no idea what they're drawing. That would be because you have sort of more connections to the way that your sibling thinks and less to this new individual. So having self-generated and sort of self-important things helps you identify that information a lot better, and it just means that you recall a lot better. And we're actually going to revisit this idea of self-generation when we look at an experiment in a couple of slides, but we're going to talk about something else before then and then integrate the two. All right, our next concept is the idea of priming. And this is when we can sort of influence individuals' memory, but indirectly. So this is the idea of sort of preparing different pathways in your brain to be activated in the future. So a priming task would involve something like showing somebody a list of words, because it's memory and psychology, of course it's lists of words. But if you gave them a list of 100 words, and maybe you make them do something with that list, maybe not, maybe you get them to read them out loud or tell you if they're all caps or small or whatever, something where they see these words. Even if they're not consciously, or even if they're not required to consciously remember them, seeing them is going to activate parts of the brain that relate to those particular concepts. And then later on, if you were asked to do another task, potentially unrelated, those pathways that had been recently activated are more likely to be reactivated because of the priming task. So the example here is if your list of words includes the word store, and then later on, when you're asked to fill in the blanks on a particular task, you'd be a lot more likely to fill in STO blank with RE to match store that you had already seen not too long ago, as opposed to, say, stork, RK, or stop, depending on how many letters you needed to use. So this is a process of sort of implicit memory. We don't realize that we're doing this. We don't realize that we've been primed for this particular setup. But because the way that our brain works, when we've recently activated our particular pathway, it's a lot easier to use that same pathway again. And this is actually partially what's involved with things like advertising. So if you don't have a personal preference on Coke versus Pepsi, and all you know is that you want a cola, if you happened to see one, even if you weren't aware of it, that would prime you to be more likely to lean towards that one. So a lot of advertising is just getting their brand in front of you, as opposed to trying to consciously influence you. All right, and then we can come back to this diagram, and this is a little bit of a weird one. It's the same graph that we've been looking at effectively, but it's been sort of turned on its side because they wanted to be able to write a lot more. So usually we have our percent correct on our y-axis on the vertical, and then we have our different groups on the x, and they've just flipped it. So I point it out because it's the only graph for this entire chapter that's oriented like this. But this is a setup where they were looking at cues and people's ability to recall words when they had or had not used those cues. And so there's a couple of steps here. So the individuals at the bottom, the ones who did very, very poorly on the recall task, were individuals who didn't participate in any kind of learning. Basically, they were given the list and then they were tested on the list, the end. And they're saying at the bottom, they used another person's cues provided for the test, so they would get some hints, but they weren't relevant to themselves. And so you can see that having not worked with those words, having not done much else in terms of deeper processing, their performance wasn't great. So about 17% recall. Our next one up is during learning, they made cues, but so that's sort of their learning task was the creation of cues. But during testing, they were only given cues that were developed by someone else. So non-self-produced cues. And so we see that they did a lot better because they engaged in a task that added some processing. But because the cues that they were using weren't relevant to them, they didn't do as well as they could. And then the top group is that they made and used their own cues, and they ended up doing much, much better. So up to 90% correct versus the 17 at the bottom. So this shows us both that more processing as well as having self-produced cues can be massively beneficial for recall. All right, and then the next couple of slides, we're actually going to be looking at 3 ways that we can achieve sort of conditions that make it optimal for us to learn. And even though they're 3 separate setups and they're kind of very different at the surface, they're all getting at the same principle underneath them. And so this is the idea that retrieval can be increased, so you can remember more things, if you match the conditions at retrieval to the conditions that existed while you were encoding or while you were learning that information. And so that's not a complex idea. It's you want to be in as much of the same state when you're sort of recalling information as you are when you're learning that information. And this just spreads it out into, we're going to look at encoding specificity, state-dependent learning, and transfer-appropriate processing, so different aspects that we can focus in on. But what we're basically saying is you want as many things to be the same when you're being tested as you were while you were studying. And this is probably why you've heard that if you know what room an exam is being written in, you should go study in that room. It's also why a lot of psychology instructors prefer to have tests written in the same room that they teach in, because it actually helps with recall. You're in the same space, preferably at the same time of day. Maybe you get to sit in the same spot. By having more things matching, it actually helps your recall because more things are the same. And we're going to sort of look at some of these examples. So with our encoding specificity, we're saying that when we learn information, we don't just learn the information on its own. We also learn information about the context in which it's learned. So which classroom were you in? Where were you when you learned this information? And so we're going to be looking at a couple of these weird looking graphs, but you're going to get very familiar with them because we have a lot of them. And so they're showing us here that they have study conditions. So that's when they were encoding. Underneath, they have test conditions. That's where were they tested. And then below that, we have a graph. And there's no labels on the x-axis, and that's because we're actually continuing from this top. So the first bar are study underwater, test underwater. So you just sort of draw the line down. But the graph is still just showing us performance, test score. And so here, they did a setup where they had students who were given lists of words, again, on cue cards this time, because they were working with scuba divers. And so half of the participants were taught these words on cue cards while scuba diving, while underwater in a pool. The other half were taught the words using cue cards sitting on the side of the pool, out of the water. And then they split those two groups into two testing groups as well. And so some of them were tested underwater and some of them were tested on land. And so what we're looking at is, okay, what happens if the conditions matched? If they were learning those words underwater and they were tested underwater, what was their performance? And on the outer sides, the orange bars, that's underwater studying and underwater testing. And then on the far side is on land studying and on land testing. And we both see that they have pretty high scores. The two orange bars are fairly high. And then in contrast, in the middle, when we have a discrepancy between testing and learning conditions, when they either learned underwater and were tested on land, or learned on land and were tested underwater, we see a pretty strong drop-off in performance. So when we have unmatched conditions, their performance suffers. And they did it both ways because, well, what if people just don't learn words well while scuba diving? But by having people sort of on and off in both conditions, they were able to say, nope, it's actually whether the conditions are matching. It's not just scuba diving or not scuba diving. But we're going to look at a couple of different setups like this, and you're going to start seeing pretty consistent patterns in the graphs. So this was done in the 70s. Then, like 20 years later or so, they came back and they did another one, and they looked at students who were studying for tests, and they had students who studied in noisy conditions versus quiet conditions, and then they had tests written in noisy versus quiet conditions. Same basic setup here, and they were like, okay, if the conditions matched, or if they didn't match, how did their performance change? And again, Aaron had warned me that they might be moving a piano upstairs, so apparently it's back. But yeah, so again, we have our two outer bars. The two orange bars are higher. And it's kind of interesting. We see a little bit of a difference there as per usual. I have my pet peeve where they don't have any error bars, and I would really like to have error bars to know that there's a significant difference, but it does look like if they're taking the test in the quiet, they seem to do a little bit better in both cases, which kind of makes sense, but still we do see that matching is better for both cases, even above and beyond doing better being tested in quiet conditions. So again, it's better to match the context where you're being tested with the context in which you're encoding that information to begin with. All right, our next concept is saying, okay, so instead of our external environment, what about our internal environment? Oh my goodness. And this is state-dependent learning. And so here we're talking about your internal state. So we're saying that what you learn isn't just associated with the external environment, it's associated with what's going on inside your body as well. So if while you're studying you have lots and lots of caffeine in your system, you should probably take the test with lots of caffeine in your system. And this isn't just for drugs, this is also things like mood and level of tiredness and physical fatigue and all sorts of things. So again, as many different states that can match between testing and studying are going to do better. And you'll notice that, again, we have another one of these. This one was done in '89. Same basic setup. They were looking at people who were sad versus happy. I think in this case, they had them recall a memory that made them either very happy or very sad before testing and studying. But again, we have our orange bars are highest, Blue bars are smallest, same setup. And so if you look into the literature, there are thousands of these studies. They've tested pretty much everything you can think of, but we've just sort of picked a couple that work for each. And then the last of these is actually focusing on the type of material that you're learning and how you go about learning it. And this is the concept of transfer appropriate processing. So this says that our memory performance is better if the type of task at encoding matches the type of task at retrieval. So again, we want stuff to match, but here it's about how you're encoding that information. What tasks are you using to learn it, and what tasks are you being tested with? And so the example that they've used here is if during encoding, if during studying, they use either a meaning task or a rhyming task. So they would ask you questions like, does this word fit into this sentence? Or does it rhyme with this other word? And that was your exposure to the words. And then for retrieval, both were tested with a rhyming task. And if you remember from our talk about levels of processing, you'd actually think that the one who was given meaning type processing, they should have done better because meaning is a deeper level of processing. But if we look at our performance here, the individuals who were trained and tested using rhyming ended up doing significantly better. So almost 50% correct, as opposed to 33% correct, which tells us that having those matching conditions actually ended up giving them a boost above what should have been a better encoding process. So that's even more impressive when you think about it. Yep. So if they had a list of words and they say, does this one rhyme with violet? Or does it rhyme with car? And that would be a rhyming task. And it's not meant to be like a hard test, but it's meant to be a how many of the words, I guess as a recall side, they'd give you the words that rhyme, and then you'd have to recall the list. But yeah, they'd kind of get you to do it in the opposite direction. But yeah, so it's kind of neat to see stuff like that. And this I actually have seen firsthand. When I was an undergraduate, I've told you guys, I did my degree in biology. And undergrad biology, especially at large universities, means that you do multiple choice tests all the way to the end of your degree. And it's a lot of memorizing. It's a lot of, can you match this definition with this term? And so my studying methods, once I got better at it, was to make cue cards. One side's a definition, the other side's the term. And I would make thousands of cue cards, one shoebox per class, and I'd flip through them because on the exam it was which term matches this definition or which definition matches this term. And so testing myself, or I guess studying to get to there, I would just do my cue cards from one side and then from the other. Can I fill it out both directions? Tested very well. But you notice that right off the bat in this class, I warned you guys that I don't test like that. I specifically test understanding. And some of my hints for good study methods are things like explain a concept to someone else, try and teach a topic to someone. And that's because you have to have the same level of understanding to explain a concept as you do to sort of make connections between topics on a test. So even though I still use multiple choice questions, it's presented in such a way that you have to think about it a little bit more deeply. And that's why I encourage study techniques that get you to think a little bit more deeply. So that's one of those times where I introduce the technique but don't explain why, and then we get to explain why later on. But yeah, so that's all sorts of different ways, and that might be something that you keep in mind when you're deciding how to study for different tests in the future. All right. Lovely. Okay, so next we're going to start talking about a couple of effects, sort of patterns in how we recall things. And of course, it's going to be about remembering lists because we always have lists of words. So whether or not these apply very well to real world would be debatable, but we're going to use this serial position effect. And this is basically describing a relationship between a word's position in a list and the probability that you can recall that word at a future task. And so usually they're going to give you a list of words somewhere between 10 and 50 words. We usually look at like 20 or so, but of course they've done this forever. So they have all possible lengths of lists. And we have two patterns that we tend to see. We see the difference here being primacy effect, where it's easiest to remember things at the very beginning of the list. We remember sort of the primary exposures. And then we also have recency effect, where it's more easy to remember things that you've encountered more recently. So stuff at the end of the list. And so if you think about it, if we remember the early stuff and we remember the late stuff, that means that the stuff in the middle kind of gets lost. And the idea here, without getting too deep into it, is that this is kind of starting to show us the difference between short-term or immediate memory and long-term memory. So in that time span from getting from the beginning of the list to the end of the list, maybe the earliest stuff that you were exposed to has started to be moved over to the long-term procedures. So it's starting to get stored away, which is why we can remember those. And there's a lot of debate as to whether or not that's actually what's happening, but that's a good way to frame it. And so we can look at an example here, and this is some real data where we're looking at, okay, so our probability of recall on the Y, and then on the bottom on our x-axis, we have serial position in the original list. So they have a list here of 20 different words. How likely were they to remember the first word versus the 10th versus the 20th? And we see that they did pretty good remembering the first couple. They don't do very well in the middle, and they do pretty good at remembering the last couple. So that shows us primacy at the beginning and recency at the end. So it kind of lines up. And so if I wanted to, so let's say if we wanted to sort of pick this apart, if we wanted to say, okay, is it actually the fact that primacy is caused by the fact that stuff's being moved into our long-term storage, and recency is just because stuff is still in our sort of current memory, it's in our short-term / working memory, we currently have it held and are holding on to it. Well, I guess we could do something that distracts someone long enough to clear it from their immediate memory. What if we get them to do another task that distracts them? Can we make that recency effect go away? And the answer is yes. If you test them immediately, you give them the list of 20 words and then test their recall right away, we see the purple line, which has our primacy and recency, normal U-shaped curve. If we wait 30 seconds, which is longer than the duration of our immediate memory, then that sort of tick up at the end goes away. The recency effect goes away. So that gives us some evidence that the recency effect is probably driven by the fact that we're holding information in our short-term or immediate memory. And they've done this lots of different ways with lots of different techniques, but they seem to get pretty much the same results every single time, which is why we get these pretty predictable curves. But it's kind of nice to see that something as simple as waiting 30 seconds makes one of our two effects go away completely, which is very cool. All right, and then the last part of this chapter, we're going to start talking about forgetting. So we've spent so long talking about remembering and storing things for remembering. And now we're going to go the other way and say, okay, well, why do we forget? What's happening when we forget? And there are two big sort of categories here, and this is kind of logical. The first is that it's a failure of encoding. So maybe you never stored the information to begin with. So we talked about at the beginning on our sort of long chart that showed going from sensory input to our immediate memory to our long-term memory. If we don't pay attention to something, it might be forgotten at the level of sensory input. Our sensory memory might never have sort of any awareness of it. We might drop it right there. So maybe there was lack of attention at the time, you didn't notice it, so there's no way you could have remembered it. Maybe we didn't pay enough attention to it. So we had some attention but didn't give it a deep enough processing. We noticed it in passing and immediately moved on. So as soon as it was out of our immediate memory, it was gone. We forgot at that second stage. And that sometimes happens because we only encode the important details. If it wasn't relevant at the time, we don't feel the need to send it off to long-term storage. So maybe we just never made a longer-term memory of it. The other idea is this idea of a decay of memory trace. And this basically says that, okay, we've stored it, we've encoded it just fine, but those pathways that I've been talking about where you walk to where the memory is stored, those deteriorate in time. Again, kind of like a path. If you stop taking that path, it'll grow over and then it's harder to find in the future. So this is the idea that a physical trace in our nervous system would fade away over time if we don't use it. And that's where the phrase, if you don't use it, you lose it, would come from for memory, where if you don't think about it often, it would just go away. Yep.
You say that we choose it, it's important. I think it's a subconscious thing, right? But how can we change that? Can we choose? Like, how is there ways to like trick ourselves into choosing what we remember?
Well, that's some of the like deeper levels of processing stuff. If you associate it with more things, you're like, if I'm spending all this time and effort, then yeah, it's probably important. So you can kind of stack the cards in your favor to be like, yeah, we look at how it's relevant to myself and look at how it connects to this other system and look at all these other things. That makes it sort of flag as important. It is a very complex task, and as somebody who has an absolutely awful memory, I've tried a lot of these tricks to see if it'll help. Like they say it like you put your watch on the opposite wrist to see if like the next morning you wake up and you go, oh, something's different. I need to remember to do X. It's like, no, then I'm just mad because I know I'm forgetting something. But there's lots of different ways you can do it, and some of them work better than others. But more connection seems to be the best. Okay, and so with this decay of memory trace, this would be the idea that say you meet somebody, they introduce themselves, they give you your name, or they give you their name. There we go. And then the next day you bump into them again and you have no idea what their name was. You've completely forgotten because at the time you had sort of interacted with them and then it sort of faded away because it wasn't sort of dealt with. And as more time had passed, if you didn't meet that person and didn't get reintroduced, you'd be more and more likely to forget their name. So if you meet someone and one day later see them again, maybe you'd have some recall. Maybe, oh yeah, it's Mary or Martha or something like that. It's close. But if it's like a week later or 2 weeks later, you might not have any idea of what their name was. So the longer the time has gone by, the less likely you are to remember. And this makes a lot of logical sense, but in most of the like sort of lab-based tests that they've done, there isn't a whole lot of evidence that this happens in any amount of consistency. So it's not so much that things just decay with time, because there are probably things, I guess the best example of this is you're listening to the radio and a song comes on and you immediately have a sense of nostalgia. I haven't heard this since I was in middle school. Oh my gosh, I remember all of the words. So it's not something you've been using, but you still know it. Mm-hmm.
Would the degree of memory trace increase if you had like a memory fault or disorder?
It could. We're going to see that like some of the more common disorders that cause like forgetting, it's mostly that there's just interruptions in pathways. So it's like your brain physically can't take the path out to get information because of malfunctions. So most of the time it's like, not that the path has decayed naturally, but that it's been cut off. Yeah.
Can I say that if I just recall things very often, like after a year or two, if I can remember those things, then I can remember them a lifetime?
Not necessarily, but if you do bring them up periodically, you're a lot more likely to remember them. So if, like what we were talking about with studying, if you studied right after class, and then you studied 2 days after class, and then a week after class, in a year's time, you'd be a lot more likely to remember it, but not guaranteed. Yeah. This is also one of those things like, you know, sometimes you have those intrusive memories where you did something stupid and you feel really bad about it and your mind won't let you forget. And you're like, just don't think about it so I can forget it. And you keep bringing it up and then it's just, you're like, oh no, I'm going to remember that forever. Cool. That's something else that our brain does because every time you reaccess it, you make that pathway stronger. So it's not always beneficial. All right, so if it's not that decay theory, well, if that's not the best way to explain this, what else can we use? A slightly better theory is this interference theory of forgetting. And this basically says that information is forgotten because other things that we've learned start interfering with our ability to retrieve it. And there's actually two different ways that we can do this. So we can have retroactive interference, or we can have proactive interference. And for these, I like the diagram because I cannot for the life of me remember them without. But the idea for retroactive is that new memories interfere with the recall of old memories. And my example for this is if you're learning a language. So maybe with retroactive learning, you learn Spanish, then you learn French, and the fact that you've learned something new makes it really hard for you to remember stuff that you knew before. So because French is more fresh in your mind, it gets in the way. So when you're trying to remember the Spanish word for a house, the French one is going to pop to the front of your mind, and you kind of can't get around it. With proactive interference, the arrow goes in the other direction. So the old memories, the stuff that you've known for longer, gets in the way of your new information. So your old information interferes with the recall of new information. And so again, Spanish and then French, this would be the idea that because you knew Spanish and you've known it for a very long time, even though you're trying to learn French and it's more recent, you still grab the Spanish first. And we can have sort of both of these. There isn't a guarantee that one or the other is going to happen. We can kind of have a little bit of both. And there is a lot more evidence for this theory than for the sort of decay theory. But again, we don't have a concrete reasoning as to why it happens. Okay. Our next thing to talk about are the 7 sins of memory. I found this was a very interesting way to group them. But there are sort of different errors that you can have in memory. And we have 2 different categories, errors of omission and then errors of commission. So sort of things that go away and things that come into place when they shouldn't. And so we'll start with the omission. So errors of omission are memory errors where the information cannot be brought to mind. So this is when you can't remember something. So we might have transients. So that would be more of our degrading over time. We haven't used the information for a while, so we don't necessarily have it accessible. So memories for particular events aren't always accessible because maybe we just haven't traveled that path enough. It hasn't been relevant enough. There's absent-mindedness, where memories are simply unavailable because of a failure to encode them in the first place. So absent-mindedness just meaning we haven't paid enough attention. So maybe we never got them encoded properly in the first place, so we can't recall it because it's not there to recall. And then blocking is the fact that there are not enough distinctive cues available to help us recover a specific memory. So a lot of the time we're stuck in a state where our memory is blocked because we need something to sort of jog our memory to get that information. Somebody asks you who an actor is, and then they check it on their phone, and you say, "Don't tell me. I want to get there myself." And eventually, you ask for the first letter of their name, and they give it, and then you know exactly who they're talking about. That would be overcoming blocking using a cue. So these are all errors of omission where we can't get to a piece of information for one reason or another. Our others are the errors of commission, and this is when errors happen not because we've forgotten, but because we're recalling something incorrectly, or we're recalling something that we don't want to be recalling. So instead of it being gone, it's that we're getting something and it's not what we want. And so this would be misattribution, suggestibility, bias, and persistence. And I'm actually going to talk about each of these with an example because they're a little bit cooler. So the first of these, misattribution, is when basically you credit a particular memory to the wrong thing. So déjà vu is a great example of this. So it's the feeling that you have already experienced a sequence of events. And the term déjà vu is actually French for already seen. And so you might see or encounter a situation and go, "Oh, this feels eerie, like I've been here before, I've done this before." And there are a couple of reasons why. a lot of our lives are fairly consistent. We tend to do a lot of the same things over and over again. So we might be sort of coming into the same place in the same way because that's our routine. But sometimes we misattribute it to, hey, maybe I had a dream about this, or I've totally done this before at a different time in my life or in a different universe or whatever you attribute it to. But that's a great example of misattribution. We also have that suggestibility, and we've already kind of hinted at this, and this is the idea that information that we recall isn't necessarily all that reliable. So the misinformation effect is a phenomenon where misleading information can alter our subsequent memory of that information. So this is usually used for eyewitness accounts. Sometimes in class, depending on our timing, there's a TED Talk that looks at people who actually go and talk to eyewitnesses and determine how easy it is to manipulate their memories of situations. But maybe you've noticed in a lot of cop shows, especially recently, they tell witnesses not to talk to each other. They try and separate people. And usually you think, oh yeah, you don't want people who are in on it to get their stories straight. But even neutral third parties, you don't want them talking to anyone else, because if somebody's telling them what they saw, they're going to automatically incorporate that into their own memories, and they might not even realize that they're doing it. So that's that idea that our memory is very flexible, and we can kind of change it and restore it for later, and each time we recall it, we can change it even more. So this is why it's very not good to rely just on witness information, because our memories are very, very malleable. The next is our errors of commission is biases. And this is when we use schemas. This is basically, we've talked about schemas before, as little mental shortcuts. Our brains do a really great job at sort of only storing as much information as they need to. And we fill in the blanks with the rest of it. And so we have very highly organized knowledge structures. Our brains are very complex. We make lots of connections very quickly. And sometimes it's a lot easier to just store, general information as opposed to a new memory of each situation that you encounter. So if you have a basic recognition of a location. It was a diner. You don't really care about that diner, but you have a mental schema of what a diner would look like, and you could say, yeah, it probably looked something like that. So we fill in a lot of blanks based on what we think it should have looked like. So stereotypes are an example of a schema, and it can lead us to recall extra information that fits with that stereotype. And there's a really cool study that, again, if you have some time and wanted to look up one of the TED Talks on memory, actually, I might even see if I can find it and I'll link it on Moodle just in case you're curious. But they did an automobile study, automobile accident study, oh my goodness. And they basically had people who were shown photos of a car accident, and they were given certain statements in conjunction with those images. Everyone was shown the same images within groups, but they were told different things. And so sometimes they would say, okay, well, how fast were the cars going when they bumped into each other? How fast were the cars going when they crashed into each other? How fast were they going when they smashed into each other? And even if they saw the same information, they've even done this with videos where they'll show them a video of a car accident, their estimates of speed will increase with the severity of the word in the question. So the way that questions are asked can actually change their recall. And it's based on the fact that bumping into each other implies not very fast. So I'm going to adjust my sort of mental recall to match that. And smashing into each other is very fast, so they must have been going very quickly. And again, it's amazing how malleable our memories can be. All right, and so this gives us that idea that memory is a constructive and reconstructive process where each time we pull information out of memory and do something with it, we can kind of add to it. So we piece together bits of information in ways that will make sense or match our existing schemas. And it can lead us to have very highly inaccurate recollections of that. And there's a really neat study where they've done things like this. They'll show a class this image, and they'll put it up on the screen very, very briefly, and then they'll go away. And they'll say, in your notes, draw what you just saw. And when they get the results back from people, they see a lot of the same sort of distortions. They typically draw a generic representation of a bear that matches their schema of what bears look like, the stuffed animal bears. And they're like, there's stairs. There was some stairs in the background. But if we look, they expanded. They sort of extended the range of what they saw because they were filling in those gaps. There's more stairs than they had actually seen, and they're sort of going further, and there are more of them. So there's lots of expansions, there's filling in the gaps, and there's sort of lack of accuracy. So they've drawn here, it's labeled as Winnie the Pooh, but this was clearly a panda of some kind. So there were details that were missing. But having remembered it like this, when being shown another image, they might be more likely to recognize something like theirs than what they had originally seen to begin with. That's that reconstructivity. And then the last of our errors of commission is persistence. And this is really common for post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. And this is when memories sort of pop in intrusively and they won't go away. So it's very difficult to suppress them even though you really don't want them to be there. So this would be something like flashbacks. The less severe form of that would be what I had mentioned with when you start cringing at something embarrassing that you did and it just won't go away. That's just sort of a less intense version. All right, and then so that's lots of forgettings. And before we get into sort of more forgetting, I want to take a brief moment and talk about hyperthymesia. And so you can kind of recognize at the back, the mesia part is for memory. So usually we talk about amnesia, where you forget things either in the past or you sort of can't make new memories long term. But this one is actually hyper, so overactive remembering. And so it's a rare medical condition that has people have near perfect autobiographical recall. Anything that has happened to themselves, they can recall in perfect clarity. And they seem to be quite a bit more accurate than most of us as well. And for these individuals, they tend to have significantly larger amygdalas, which implies that that might have something to do with their memory storage process. And that kind of makes sense because the amygdala is going to have lots of connections with the hippocampus, and we've already flagged the hippocampus as being really important for long-term memory storage. It's also responsible for a lot of emotional processing. So they probably have sort of, because it's all things that have happened to themselves, they have feelings about things that they have experienced personally. That might be the connection. But again, not very well understood. Okay, and we should be able to finish here. So just talking about a couple of other kinds of forgetting. These are fairly common ones. Infantile or childhood amnesia is just the fact that when you're really young, we tend not to remember what happened to us. Most of us, our sort of earliest memories would be something that happened when we were, say, 5 or 6. Some a little bit earlier, but we tend not to have consistent memories until much later in life. And this is nearly universal. And so the idea here is that maybe as our brains are maturing and growing, we're developing the structures to allow us to form long-term memory. So as children, we just don't have that ability yet. Or maybe it's a limited depth of encoding. We don't have the capacity to store it away long-term in a persistent state. Maybe. Again, not super well understood. We do also see dementia fairly commonly. And this dementia would just refer to any kind of impaired memory and other cognitive deficits that come along with brain degeneration, especially when they interfere with normal functioning. So you can have dementia due to old age. So as we get older, our brains will slowly show cognitive decline. And there are ways to protect against that. More of that, if you don't use it, you lose it. If you keep your brains active and sort of do lots of new things, you can sort of protect against that. There are also diseases and disorders that cause degeneration, things like Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease can cause retrograde and anterograde amnesia, so it seems to interfere with the parts of storing and retrieving long-term memories. And that kind of makes sense if we look at the areas of the brain that are affected. It starts sort of just before it's diagnosed. It would be sort of central in the areas where we start thinking, oh yeah, that's about where the hippocampus is. And then it spreads to more and more areas. So it'll spread across our temporal lobes to the frontal lobes and other related regions. So it is sort of a progressive disorder. All right, so those are just sort of very briefly mentioned things. If we want to talk about what might be causing memory, what is it that might be going on here? So there's a lot of different theories and a lot of different approaches. And again, we don't know if any of these are sort of more or less accurate, and it's probably some combination of all of them. We can care about biochemistry. So we kind of know that as different neurons fire together more and more often, we start seeing sort of more connections. We see changes in which neurotransmitters they're putting out. We see sort of different patterns of hormones and neurotransmitters at sort of a larger scale regulation. And they might be producing different proteins that will sort of long-term affect our behavior and how we remember things. So there is definitely some kind of biochemical involvement. It is far more complex than what we will deal with in this class, so we just acknowledge that it exists. In terms of neural circuitry, we can kind of continue on that pathway where we do see neurogenesis. We see more pathways formed as different parts of our brain are being used more and more. So if you pick up a hobby that requires a particular type of memory, you're going to have more and more of that memory because you're using it more and more. And we have sort of long-term potentiation. That's that idea that as pathways are used more and more, it's easier for them to fire. So kind of like priming, but even more extreme. And so we can use this concept of neural circuitry to actually talk about one of our possible networks of memory storage. And this is associative networks. And this is the idea that memory could be represented as a theory of concepts that are all networked together. So we can think of individual sort of concepts as different patterns of firing in the brain. And so we have fire trucks, and fire trucks are close to fires and to heat. And so if we were thinking about something like priming, there we go. When we activate fire trucks, we'd also be more likely to think about fires. And then once we've thought about fires, we're more likely to think about other things that are hot. And you can kind of have this ripple effect of activated little nodes. So each node would be its own concept, and then the lines between them are those connections between concepts. The closer the nodes are together, the more closely related they are. And that's solely a conceptual representation. And that's what's used in a lot of models in order to explain learning. Or we can have neural networks where we actually focus on, okay, so we have connections, but now we're looking at individual neurons, and we want to identify the patterns of firing that lead to different things. So this would be the idea that, okay, so it's like associative networks, but our nodes are actual physical connections between neurons, but the nodes aren't necessarily linked to a particular concept. Instead, we'd have to take a step back and look at the larger scale firing to figure out the concepts. So some people focus on the neurons, some people focus on the theoretical. The answer is probably somewhere in between. And we will finish the last, I think we have 4 slides left. We'll do the last 4 slides on Monday, but we are right at the end here. So we'll get those done on Monday and then move on into language as our last topic. So we'll stop there.